So we're using the core types of number, boolean, and string. And here in the list of parameters of this function, we're always explicitly assigning the types with a colon after the parameter name and then the name of the type. So here the names are number, boolean, and string. And in case you were wondering, these are now special identifiers. This overall here is a special syntax which is added by TypeScript. It's not part of the compiled JavaScript code. If we check that code, here these type assignments are gone because JavaScript does not support them. This colon thing after a variable or after a parameter, and then number and boolean and string, these special keywords, this is introduced by TypeScript. The TypeScript compiler understands it. The IDE here supports TypeScript and therefore doesn't complain about these special keywords. JavaScript does not understand this syntax. It doesn't understand a colon after a parameter or a colon after a variable and then the special number or string keyword. JavaScript doesn't understand this, and therefore this is not part of the JavaScript output. It's really just used by the TypeScript compiler, and then, well, it is a compiler because it converts this code to JavaScript code. Side note, you also see it switches const for var, but that's something I'll come back to later. So we have our explicit type assignments here, and it's only understood by TypeScript. Great. Why don't we have them down there? I don't have explicit type assignments here, and by the way, also not here when we calculate the result, for example, because TypeScript has a built-in feature which is called type inference. This means that TypeScript does its best, and it does a pretty good job there, to understand which type you have in a certain variable or constant. And here, for example, it understands that number 1 will always be of type number in the end because you initialize it with a number. Now, this actually is a constant, so it's even more specific than that, and the type it identifies here is not just any number, it's the number 5. Because you'll not be able to assign a new number or a new value to a const value anyways. If we would change this to a variable, so if you would use let instead, then of course this would not break anything. We can use a variable there. It might not be best practice because this value never changes, but it's also not horrible. But now if we hover over this, we see TypeScript doesn't say, okay, this has to be a 5, but still it detects that the type here is a number. Now, we absolutely could write this code here on our own. We can add a colon after the variable name on the left side of the equal sign, and then the name of the type. So basically the same we did in the parameters of this function. But this is redundant, and it actually is also not considered to be a good practice, because TypeScript is able to perfectly infer this type from there. So assigning this is not a good idea. This only changes if you would create this variable in an unassigned way. Like this, if you don't initialize it immediately. Then it's a good practice to tell TypeScript which value will eventually be stored in there, so that when you later assign a value to it, and of course it's a bit redundant here to split this in 2 lines, I'm just doing this for demo purposes. But now if I assign this here, this works because I told TypeScript in advance that this will be of type number. You don't have to do that. It also works if you don't do that. But now you could also add this 5 and you wouldn't get an error because you're not telling TypeScript anything about the type which will be stored in this variable, and therefore TypeScript allows any type. If you instead add colon number here, you're telling TypeScript, hey, eventually a number will be stored in there, and hence if you later store something else in there, like in this case where we store a string, you'll get an error here in the IDE, and of course also if you compile your code, you will get the error we already saw before. So this is how you can assign types. Now, even if TypeScript just inferred a type, and let me fix this, it will yell at you if you break that inferred type. Actually, it's wrong to say even because of course it does. Why would it not do that? Type inference is there for you to save you code, to avoid that you manually have to assign a type. Of course, TypeScript yells at you if you then use a wrong type, a type that it did not infer. For example here, if result phrase is created with let, so that it's variable, then TypeScript here infers that this will be of type string, because we initialize it with a string. So this is basically the equivalent to not initializing it and setting the type on our own, and then assigning a value later. Now, if we change result phrase to, let's say, 0 here, for whatever reason we might want to do that, well, then we get an error here, that type 0 is not assignable of type string. And that makes sense, right? TypeScript inferred that we want to store a string, we're now trying to store a number, we get an error. That's the job, the core task of TypeScript, checking types and yelling at us if we're using them incorrectly.